Drew is Secretary of the Department of Resources, Energy and Tourism. It's a role he's held since 2010. Drew chairs national committees in the energy and resources, tourism and spatial information sectors that are responsible for policy advice to the Commonwealth, state and territory governments. Felicia Mariani is the Managing Director of ATEC, for those of you who don't know what that is, the Australian Tourism Export Council. It's a national organisation of about 1,000 members who are focused on Australia's $25 billion inbound tourism sector. Prior to her role at ATEC, Felicia spent 5 years in Hobart as the CEO of Tourism Tasmania. Prior to that, she was Director of Marketing with Tourism New South Wales. Both speakers will present. Time permitting, again, we'll have a few questions from you and from me, and we'll invite them both to come up to the stage now. Thank you. Please welcome them.
Thank you, Helen. If this looks a bit like the setup for a US presidential debate, all we need is somebody here to fire the questions at us. I think Felicia, you and I should walk around the stage and threaten violence on each other at some stage, but we'll see how it goes. So we're trying something a bit different. If it goes extremely well, then Felicia and I will take full credit for this brilliant initiative. If it's a complete disaster, we've got a long list of other people to blame. So it's a double act, and it's a very deliberately so for reasons that I'll get to in a moment. In my role as Secretary of the Tourism Department, I chair the senior officials group that advise the 9 Australian tourism ministers, Commonwealth, state and territory. And I do that with my colleagues, the senior state and territory officials. I want to acknowledge their input and support for this presentation. But if the 9 of us were up here, it would all look a bit green. Our focus is not on the marketing side. We're policy people. We want to talk about the supply side policy issues that affect the industry. The title of this presentation is very loaded, whole of government. So this is work that has to cut across all of the portfolios with an interest in tourism in all 9 Australian governments. Tourism ministers, by and large, are not the treasurers, they're not the transport ministers, they're not the planning ministers, they're not the employment ministers, they're not the immigration ministers and so on. They seek to influence all of their portfolio colleagues, their cabinet colleagues in this area. So whole of government across 9 governments. Second, working with industry, the second limit. This is not about government saying, we think we know what you need and here's what we're going to do about it. This is about government and industry working in partnership on what we can do together. And the third limb of the title, to achieve the potential. That's the whole point of it. How can we do better than business as usual? Felicia.
Thank you. And just by way of background, for those who don't necessarily understand ATEC, the Australian Tourism Export Council, we're actually a national industry body, but I think what makes ATEC extremely unique is we don't necessarily have a sectoral focus. We actually connect with a very broad cross-section of the industry that spans from small to medium enterprises in regional Australia right through to airlines, airports and multinational corporations. The commonality of our membership base is that they're all engaged in inbound tourism. So in preparing for today, we actually tried to canvass the views of many of those members so that hopefully what we're presenting to you is a very broad industry perspective on how 2020 is actually tracking. I guess the key issue really emerging for us is the issue of communication. I think we've heard today there have been significant announcements that have been made in this area, but the difficulty has been that the line has not been drawn from those announcements to the purpose for which they were designed within T2020. So the industry's inability to connect those dots has probably resulted in some of the disconnect that's occurred over the term. These things, however, are all fixable, and I think the fact that there is now very valuable things to talk about gives substance to the need for better communication. So we're looking forward to discussing that with you today, Drew.
Okay, so quick introductions about what is Tourism 2020 and how we got to this point for those who haven't been on this journey. The starting point is really 2008, where Mr. Ferguson commissioned Margaret Jackson and a blue chip panel to produce a report on future directions for the Australian industry. It was a blueprint. It said these are the sorts of issues that government and industry need to focus on. That became the National Long-Term Tourism Strategy with that memorable NLTTS acronym that was worked by all of the 9 governments through their cabinet processes, worked with industry, signed off, and was really the action plan in 2009. From that, a whole lot of working groups were formed and a lot of research was commissioned and undertaken. And then in 2010, Tourism Australia did the work that really turned this into what could we achieve if all of this work was done. And that became the Tourism 2020 Industry Potential. It specified the goals and what would success look like. And you heard in Leo Jago's presentation some early performance reporting on that. The T2020 label that we're now working under is really focusing down on 6 priority issues and the underpinning research agenda. So the balance of our presentation will be, where are we at on those 6 priorities? What are the policy reforms that we're working on, and where to next? Because this isn't you don't get this done in 2011-12 and think it'll stick through to 2020. It always evolves. I'm going to say where we're at and what I think we're doing now. Felicia will offer the industry comment. So we'll get started. So the first priority is growing demand, growing supply from Asia. Now, I don't need to rehearse all of the Asian statistics. You've heard it more than sufficiently already this morning. The graph on your left is it's from the Tourism Research Australia work, and it was also one of the key graphs in the Asian Century White Paper. 2 things to look at. You can see that kick up in the red line, which is China, down the bottom there, but that orange line at the top is the rest of Asia. It's Asia. China is key, but it's all of Asia. 2 statistics that I think we're going to be looking at very closely. In these forecasts, we've just gone over the 500,000 visitors from China per year. We're at that stage right now. And the forecast is we'll hit 1 million per year by 2020. Now, that's a lot. I had this conversation with Australia's ambassador in Beijing, Francis Adamson. 1 million by 2020, Francis. Sort of said, well, I wouldn't mind betting we get there before 2020. And that'll be certainly one of the indicators as to how this is working. The second is that issue around satisfaction. The little chart at the bottom is the first of what will be a time series of understanding visitor satisfaction by those dimensions of accommodation, shopping, restaurants, food, value for money, customer service, and understanding how that is tracking in our different source markets. You're seeing in there the coloured bars, the rest of the world, and the black lines, Asia. And you notice that there's a difference, that the rest of the world is more likely to say very satisfied compared to Asia. Asia is still unsatisfied. You add the 2 together, we've got satisfied or very 84% in Asia, the rest of the world 90%. I'm averaging, I'm picking customer service as the exemplar of this. Of course, it's very dangerous to compare across cultural boundaries. That's the way these terms are interpreted and their nature for scoring, but tracking how this develops will be key. Policy response. What's the policy response to the rise of Asia? Well, one that is obvious is capitalising on the marketing. The government has announced this new $48 million Asian marketing fund that Tourism Australia is now deploying. That's $48 million additional to their existing marketing over the next 4 years, targeted in specific Asian growth sectors. But the core policy question, of course, is Australia ready? Is the supply side ready for this Asian boom? And how can we get more ready?
Asia's an area where it seems to be tracking well. The figures are up, the breadth of engagement is significant, and the barriers to access are coming down with all of the additional capacity that we've achieved out of this important region. We're starting to introduce some important mechanisms to better connect industry with the growth presented by the Asian century. The research being developed is extremely useful and will help us to understand as an industry how to better engage with this important market. What do we need to do, particularly as this market is maturing so quickly? We need to stay on top of that. Supply side issues, however, still need a great deal of support if we're going to rise to that challenge. The Asia Marketing Fund that you've announced is actually a significant key enhancement. Pleasing to see the additional marketing support, but also that some of that money has actually been quarantined, 10% of the allocation roughly, to actually look at monitoring our activities in that area and ensuring that we're staying on top of how the market is changing and growing. So great to see that we're making that commitment to research. The announcement earlier this year of the STEEP process, Strategic Tourism Investment Grants, under the Welcoming Chinese Visitors banner. The Minister spoke about that earlier in his speech. ATEC was actually fortunate enough to be successful in that process, and we've aligned with 3 other commercial providers. And together we will deliver what is accredited training, certified training nationally, to ensure that the industry has the skills to adapt to the changing needs and demands of this market. We also will have a direct connect into the Chinese consumer through that consortium in relationship with China Ready and Accredited, who is a partner in the program. And while all these are really positive outcomes, I think the issue you raised there, Drew, about policy is probably a good one and where the gaps may sit. The e-visa announcement that we heard about this morning is excellent. And I think Andrew asked the question, however, can we do it better? And that's what we need to keep asking. I know we're talking about our visa processing being within 3 days and 5 days, and indeed the ADS group travel visas are performing extremely well. There does seem to be some question from the industry, as well as from the coalface in China, about the process to get to the processing point. So what goes into the application, particularly out of the China market for FIT travellers. And that seems to be where there is some challenge. That's exactly what we're hearing, as I said, both here and abroad. Near Asian destinations have created streamlined processing, particularly focusing on systems for the high net worth visitors. And this is exactly now what the segment is starting to expect as they travel around our region. The US, and again the Minister mentioned this, recognising the importance of tourism in kickstarting their ailing economy, and indeed China within that, they've actually also upped the ante, and they've improved their own processing systems, and they are evidently far less complex and much more expeditious than they have been in the past. From the industry's perspective, what we're saying is maybe there's a need here to do a really serious benchmarking survey to understand how we stack up against major competitors, particularly within the Asia-Pacific region, who are doing some really interesting things in how they're changing their approach to the high net worth traveller. Let's separate fact from fiction. Let's find out how we really stack up. And this analysis has to look at not just processing times, but what it takes to go into the application process, and indeed the customs processing approach that Australia has to ensure that we are absolutely at the top of our game.
I'll take that as a pitch for our research agenda, which I'll come to in a moment. Okay. The second priority in T2020 is digital capability. Now, you're looking at a 2010 graph. Let's talk about it. It's important. And this is measuring 2 metrics about the tourism, in Australian tourism industry's online presence, in there around 84%, and what proportion is transaction ready. That is, a customer can go online and book, pay, etc., conduct a transaction, and that was down at 35% in 2010. Now, clearly, that bottom one in particular has to be a lot higher. So a key priority is how do we improve the online presence and capability of tourism businesses. This metrics will be updated in 2013, we'll be reviewing them. Leo, I think after the presentation we heard previously, we're going to have to add mobile online capability to what we're measuring, because it's very clear how critical that will be. So the policy response in this area, how do we help tourism businesses get online and improve their capacity? The National Online Strategy for Tourism Operators set this out. We developed an e-kit distributed through the Australian Tourism Data Warehouse. That's now being upgraded with training and development capacity. And we're developing a widget that all tourism sector can deploy for booking, and that will be distributed and completed, we hope, in the first half of 2013. That's on the industry side. On the government side, of course, it's essential that Tourism Australia maintain its leading-edge position online. TA's Facebook page is already the world's largest Facebook site with 3.5 million. How Andrew McAvoy responds to 3.5 million friends every night, I have no idea, but he doesn't. TA is in the process of moving their a mirror of their website in Chinese to be operated in China. That is to make sure that the TA content is directly accessed by Chinese consumers, not having to go through their firewall. And we've funded the translation of all of the data records in the Australian Tourism Data Warehouse into Chinese.
Thanks, Drew. This is a big one. Industry's perception is that since the National Online Strategy that Drew referred to was launched, there really hasn't been a lot of movement in this area. Now, while we know that this is not the case, unfortunately, the information, again, hasn't really been communicated through properly to the industry. Operators are still very confused by the complexity of all the players in the digital space, and as a consequence, they remain disconnected and at the margins in this very important area. So what are the key elements for the future? Well, industry enablement will be key here. We have excellent tools like the Tourism Need Kit, again, that we talked about. They provide great resources for training and education, but there is actually more that's needed. The graph already shows you that there's only about 1/3 of this industry that is actually engaged in real-time distribution of their product online. An even bigger shortfall in this area that I have to highlight is the fact that probably only between 10 and 20%, depending on how big you make the universe, of all Australian tourism businesses in this country are actually listed on ATDW, which is the primary engine that drives the state tourism websites as well as Australia.com. Now, this is sadly largely due to a couple of complexities. One is the extensive resource that it takes for each of the states to actually manage, maintain, and keep current all of this information. It's a huge task and very expensive. There's also a lack of consistency that exists in regulations to enter into these databases from state to state. Some states charge a fee for entry, others are free. Some require product accreditation, others do not. This creates a real challenge when you're a national product that you actually have to conform to different regulation standards in each state in which you operate. So, while education in all of this is quite important, as I said before, enablement is crucial. The two major barriers that are probably hindering the engagement of industry in digital distribution. The first of those has to do, sadly, with the general aversion of most products to want to pay commission for product distribution. The second is probably more so an apprehensiveness of the industry to engage more broadly in the complexities of the digital world. Now, the former is actually a philosophical issue that will take a little time to work through, but the latter actually is addressable. But we need to assist the industry in helping them to overcome their fears and complexity and engaging with digital distribution. My own personal experience on this one was in my role as a CEO at Tourism Tasmania, where we actually implemented a one-on-one digital coaching program. And I know that that program has been maintained with the subsequent CEO, and in fact, I understand last night they've actually extended that now out to other industries within the state. That, I think, is a testament to the fact that there's a need for customized training in this area, and yes, it is going to be hand-holding, but that's the only thing that's actually going to drive movement in this area and really shift the needle significantly on the industry's take-up of digital. Spending resources on piecemeal programs, they're great outputs, but they're not going to get us to the outcome that we need, and that is enabling the industry to master the skills necessary to be effective in this complex world.
It's a big one. They're all big ones. The next, there are a few larger. The investment and the investment challenge in the supply side and the associated regulatory reform agenda. So as Leo Jago's presentation highlighted, a lot of investment is needed in the supply side, particularly accommodation, but not only accommodation. What's the role of policy? Well, there's actually a marketing role and a regulatory reformer role. Leo's organisation, TRA, will be tracking progress on this continuously through that National Investment Monitor. Firstly, the marketing. Reference was made, and Minister Ferguson talked about this new partnership between Austrade and Tourism Australia, where tourism investment, inbound investment into tourism, foreign investment, is now one of the 4 national investment priorities marketed worldwide by Austrade. He mentioned the initial prospectus of 80 Australian projects launched in May this year. How did those 80 come about? The first list, state and territory nomination and consultation with industry. The first revision of that prospectus will be due out later this month. 12 of those 80 are already progressing down an investment pathway. Around 30 are going to come off the list, and about another 30 are going to come on the list through various processes. Such a prospectus will continuously evolve. What TA wants is industry to be banging on the door saying, put my project on your list. I want Austrade's help marketing my project worldwide. That's what we want to hear. And the Minister also announced the major project facilitation role this morning that the Commonwealth is taking on to help those major projects through the regulatory agenda at the Commonwealth level. So this marketing of investment in tourism is a serious intervention. The ability for Austrade to go out and have product to sell, opportunities to sell in Australia is huge. And the whole Tourism 2020 agenda and the potential of that overnight spend is the key to it. Their job is to make the connections. They're not going to sign the deals. Business does what business does to make the deals. Their job is to make the connections between the investors, get them interested in Australia, get them talking to the project developers, and then you guys will do the business. On the regulatory reform, so the graphs you're looking at is the accommodation approvals. This was the point that Leo made, but picked it out as the highlight one for further investment, but of course it's not the only one. The other graph is the note that the Minister referred to of a quick preview of this tourism investment report card. I mentioned the research work that we did in developing the Tourism 2020 agenda. We looked at what are the barriers to this investment in Australia, the regulatory barriers that are operating at the state, territory and Commonwealth level. That came up with around 30 things that if governments made changes to these 30 regulatory policy settings, that would facilitate deeper investment. Ministers signed up, the 9 tourism ministers signed up to go back to their cabinets and say, let's see how we can go knocking some of these over. And we'll be publishing later this month a scorecard by all 9 jurisdictions, by the 30 odd recommendations, where are we at with each of them and how we're tracking. Here's some of the summary data. Around 48% have been accepted and implementation is underway. Another 40-odd-9% are still in consideration and a small number have been rejected. But this will be a continuous monitoring process of improving the investment climate. Felicia.
Sure, thanks. I guess this is where the two-speed tourism economy really comes to play, and there has been a lot of really good growth and opportunity in some of the capital cities, but regional areas are still struggling to keep up. The announcement that the Minister made about the regional development funds will certainly go some way to assisting regional properties to actually improve their product offering. But those industry operators have expressed some concern to us in terms of the timing. I know they're due on the 14th of December, applications close. This is actually leading into obviously a peak travel period for these guys. These are operators who are going to have to prepare their own applications. They don't have the luxury of hiring somebody to do that for them, and they have to continue to run their businesses at the same time. There probably is a need for a bit of support in some way, helping smaller operators to prepare these applications. Otherwise, what will happen, it will simply end up going to the usual suspects who probably have a jump in this area on some of the small regional players. One of the other concerns that the smaller end of the industry expressed to us around the regional funding grants is that obviously the dollar-for-dollar match funding requirement, which we understand the importance of that and why it's there. But for those grants of under $100,000, which is where most of these operators will be playing in that space, it's very difficult for them to raise that dollar-for-dollar match capital funding. So there is a chance here, or a risk, that the exact audience that this great pool of funding resource was created for may in fact fail to connect with it as an important part of improving their offering. On a larger scale, the recent LDK report that was put out as a part of this whole process identified very serious supply constraints on our industry's growth. They identified 5 key major areas where we were falling short and concluded that there was absolutely a very strong case for regulatory reform for our industry. But this is where the whole of government approach really becomes very critical. Unfortunately, it's great the federal government has some levers that they can pull, but largely, a lot of these issues are state mandated. So it has to be something that each state is prepared to look at on a whole of government level. And we would like to commend, as part of this process, the formation of the Tourism Cabinet subcommittee in Queensland recently to look precisely at these issues of whole of government working together to improve tourism. And we would encourage that same type of structure to be considered in each state if we're serious about regulatory reform.
Having sat at the Tourism Minister's table when they reviewed the scorecard, I can assure you they're serious, and the states are taking very seriously the comparative assessment, and a bit of competitive federalism is actually, I think, going to work well for us in that area. Transport. Now, transport is more than aviation, but for the interest of brevity, and given that aviation is so critical, I'm only going to comment on the aviation access part of it. This chart is tracking the changes in Australia's direct services from key markets over the last few years. And the key point is we've now got a record high inbound international seat capacity, and it's more than doubled in China and other key Asian ports. Probably one of the most promising points, though, in this, in the detail behind this, is that many of the new routes include very promising developments for regional dispersal, an all-important characteristic. Shanghai to Cairns, Guangzhou to Brisbane, Dubai to Adelaide, Doha to Perth, Singapore to Darwin, and some of the expansions of routes are also, Singapore Gold Coast, are very promising. Policy response in this area, these bilateral air service negotiations are critical, and the support for the regional airports is critical, and both are ongoing policy issues. Felicia?
Yes, thanks, Drew. Those 9 gateway ports that Drew's mentioned have been really critical in terms of the recent capacity announcements. But the thing that we need to be concerned about is obviously those routes are always going to rely on the success of the performance of those routes for their sustainability. And if they don't stack up, whatever trial periods might be considered within each of those carriers' minds, they may not last beyond that period. So that is the challenge that we need to work on. All the major carriers today, let's be realistic, they've become far more numbers focused. There's much more emphasis that's put on route efficiency, on aircraft utilization, on ROI, and on load factors generally. We just need to recognize that the landscape globally for aviation is a fiercely competitive field, and we need to understand how that impacts on our relationships as the tourism industry with the aviation sector. A healthy aviation sector means a healthy tourism industry. So we need to work in partnership on some of this. One of the points I do want to make, however, is this regional dispersal issue that you've raised, Drew, and that is that a lot of this additional capacity does still tend to be capital city-centric, East Coast focused. We need to consider seriously how we extrapolate this additional capacity in the major population centres to more regional parts of Australia, who continue to struggle under the dynamics of a changing visitor profile. We have to work harder to try to create some level of connectivity between these major centres and the regional airports that can actually act as feeders for some of the dispersal that we're looking to achieve in our more remote parts of Australia. The cost base for regional carriers makes this somewhat prohibitive in terms of our consumers accessing all these areas. So this is all part of the mix, and though it's a very difficult and challenging task, the working group does need to take a look at this and figure out how we can start the process of really trying to address this issue. I just want to make one point on access more broadly, because it is very aviation focused. The cruising has actually been the standout success for tourism in Australia, which has had 7 consecutive years of double-digit growth. It has a long value chain in delivering economic benefits to the country. It was $830 million that was contributed to the national economy in 2010-11. The growth presented by this sector is probably somewhat underappreciated in terms of the access strategy, because we do tend to focus a lot on aviation, which is core, but we need to put an emphasis on this side of access as well as a real driver for the tourism economy.
The all-important labour and skills priorities. Now, I'm grateful that Mr. Bowen has spoken before me, but let me drill down on just a few points quickly. Here's a chart of those 8 nominated so-called hotspots that we're currently working at with these tourism employment plans. So what is happening in each of these locations is that we're taking consultants in to work with the local tourism industry to develop local, for their specific location, skills and employment solutions. 2 have now been completed and are in implementation. That's Broome and the Red Centre. 2 are about to start. That's the Mornington Peninsula, Phillip Island one, and for Sydney, and the balance we hope in 2013. So targeting in on what can those regions do, how can they help themselves, what are the tools and procedures that they can use. Ministers have mentioned the seasonal workers program. The pilot has been completed with the small number of East Timorese folk working in the Broome accommodation industry. That was successful. How do we know it's successful? Because the operators want them back, and that's the key. This has now been broadened to more South Pacific workers in 5 different parts of Australia, again with a focus on the accommodation sector. You heard Minister Ferguson really press the point that for this sort of policy intervention to stand up, we need industry to take it up. That's a call to the accommodation sector. The Tourism Workforce Development Strategy, that $8.2 million initiative, Parliamentary Secretary will be talking about that after us, so I won't go into it. Indigenous training, you've heard about, particularly the Uluru development, and you've heard Mr. Bowen talk about working holiday maker and other forms of visa reform. So we understand this is going to be a priority. This is serious policy work, and it's absolutely on the agenda. Felicia.
Thanks, Drew. These are terrific outputs, and I think the industry understands the importance of that in trying to address the labour and skills area. I have to unfortunately say it would be remiss of me to stand here today and not mention the key issue that's been raised with all of the industry is the implications of the Fair Work Act on our performance, on our productivity and our ability to compete globally. It represents one of the most significant drains on the industry's ability to attract staff, keep staff, and to make sure that we have the workforce that we need for these peak periods. The cost and complexity of the system is unworkable for many small operators in particular, and it's challenging our competitiveness. It's making us a highly unaffordable destination, not only in the eyes of our own domestic visitors, but particularly as a global destination on the world stage. Increasingly, our visitors are finding it a challenge to find a meal in the city on a Sunday night or on a public holiday, and that situation is even worse in regional parts of the country. And our current approach to managing this issue is actually completely at odds with the cosmopolitan and the contemporary profile that we project on the world stage. We understand that there is a mix of requirement here. We know that, yes, the working holiday visa that the Minister spoke about previously provides us with a short-term relief, particularly in some of these regional areas that critically need short-term casual staff at peak periods in the year. But this industry is, in fact, also committed to the upskilling of local people, of local Australians who want to work. But we need a mix and a blend of those two, and we need flexibility and common sense in how we approach this issue. While we know it's probably not something that wants to be dealt with from the fin review on either side of government, it is an issue that the industry does have to contend with, and we need to work our way through here to ensure that we can deliver the type of service that our visitors expect when they arrive.
Sixth priority is quality. Now, quality's got a number of dimensions, but again, I don't need to rehearse for this audience the linkage between quality, customer satisfaction and success. But let's talk about 2 dimensions of it. One is the quality accreditation part. Mr. Ferguson announced again this morning where we're heading on the TQual TIC program. This was launched in 2011. It now 11 schemes are incorporated, logos shown, with 13,000 operators. This program is scheduled for its first early implementation review in 2013, where clearly the question is this working? Where do we go next? How does it fit into the new online era? Issues like preferential promotion and how that is rolling out. The second dimension of quality are the products themselves and the investment in it. We've talked about those TQual grants, $40 million over 4 years, the large and the small size grants. 187 small grants worth $15 million for product development have been already awarded, and 7 large strategic investments Those large strategic investments around fundamentals like national landscapes, the Ayers Rock Resort, Dreamworld's Aboriginal Wildlife Experience, Arnhem Land Cultural Tourism Plan, Broome Multicultural Arts Plan, and tools for industry to welcome Chinese visitors. Felicia's already mentioned the Regional Development Fund, opened just a few weeks ago, with that particular focus on improving the quality of the existing product in regional Australia.
Drew, it's good to hear that you're going to be doing an early review, as you called it, for this one. This is probably one area where there were a lot of mixed feelings, quite complex in terms of getting to understand what the industry, what value the industry saw in the accreditation programs and how this all worked and where did TPOC fit in. One of the biggest areas that came up, though, was probably the lack of consumer marketing around this issue, which was in fact seen in the beginning as one of the core drivers of success in this area. And the feeling from the industry was that probably the consumer marketing side of the equation hasn't been commensurate with the push that's been applied to industry. So there was also then the question about, well, what is the relevance there today in terms of the onset of such strong use of social media, of community endorsements, of group purchasing, all these things that are coming into the mix, which is this still the right way to address this? So the issue of looking at this now and taking all of the changing landscape into consideration will speak on.
Finally, there's the underpinning research theme. And I mentioned at the start of when we were establishing what we now call T2020, there's an amount of foundation research. Now, there's a point to this very busy slide. You know, if we would have put every damn logo we could find of anyone that's doing research on it. But the fact that it's so busy and that there are so many logos is the point. There's a lot of research happening, both within industry, within academia, within government, and in the specialist consultancy that are working in this area. The question is, how do you harness this research power? So the Tourism Research Advisory Board, which I have the privilege to chair, tries to bring this together, and we've got all of these sectors at the table in trying to develop that coherent plan. Leo has already talked about the interest